Hi, my name is Drew Hood, and I am glad to be a part of this teaching and preaching ministry class at Cedarville. It's been wonderful getting to know everybody and seeing your feedback and interacting with you in the forums. And so I am really excited to share with you today my parable, which comes from Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 through 35. And so I have chosen the NIV, and I am going to recite it to you as best as I can from memory. Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 23. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle his accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought before him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his family and everything that he had be sold in order to pay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him, and he begged him and pleaded, "Be patient with me, and I will pay back everything." The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him and demanded that he be paid back what he owed. The servant fell before him and on his knees and begged him, "Please be patient with me, and I will pay it back." But he refused and went off and had the servant thrown into jail until he could pay off the debt. The other servants saw what had happened, and they were outraged, and they went and told the king everything that had taken place. Then the master called the servant before him and said, "You wicked servant, I canceled all of your debt because you begged me to, because you fell and..." Had to take a brief pause there because someone walked into my office. So going back to, then the master called in the servant. He said, "I canceled all of your debt because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you?" In anger, his master handed him over to be tortured until he should be able to pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat you unless you forgive your brothers and sisters from your... This is one of my favorite parables. I also think it's one of the more difficult ones to sort of separate out and interpret. And so for our class, I think it's a really interesting one to sort of tackle because there's a couple different things going on here. We have, really three main characters. We have the king or the master. We have the first servant who owed so much money. And then we have the second servant who owed very little but was mistreated by the first servant. And so when we look at this, we have to ask ourselves, is this supposed to be an equation? Are we equating these characters with some person? Or is this, analogy? Because if we take it strictly as an equation, then we have, we could say, well, the king or the master represents God. But when looking at this, we see that not only is the king gracious and merciful, but he's also very ruthless, right? He throws the family of the first servant into, slavery and sends the servant to be tortured. There's there's a lot going on here that I think we have to unpack. First and foremost being, the sum or the total that was owed by the first servant. Obviously, the main point of this total that he owed was the absolute impossibility of paying this back. And so, we look at that and we understand our need for mercy and forgiveness because of the impossible sum that we have tallied up. But beyond that, how do we interpret it as looking at it from a theological point of view? Is God the ruthless king? Is God the merciful, gracious master? And I think part of the problem is when we read parables, we often want to equate them to something very, tangible. So it's sort of a mirror of reality, when in reality, parables are meant to be, read as analogies. So they may represent or show pieces of reality, but also contain things that are, to be interpreted for a different purpose. And so when we look at something like this, we have to understand that that parables are theological, but they're not wholesale pieces of theology. And I think that's one of the things that helps us to interpret a passage like this. So the first part of the parable focuses on this enormous debt that is owed and the mercy and grace that the king or the master shows on his first servant. But then it also shows the contrasting behavior that the servant shows to his fellow servant. Now, anybody who heard this parable in ancient Near Eastern times would have understood that the first servant was definitely owed what was owed to him from the second servant. However, it's that contrast in the attitude with which he takes and the treatment that he gave that makes the big difference here. And so when we look at, like, you know, the failure of the first servant to show mercy and the rebuke, we then see sort of the primary instruction of this parable in what happens. The king sees and understands, he's told what happens to this second servant, and he's enraged, obviously, because with grace and mercy also comes judgment. And so in the kingdom, these two things are represented in this parable: grace and mercy shown to a people, but also the judgment that will come if those people do not live up to being called disciples, if they do not live up to practicing what they preach. The real bulk of this comes in verse 33, where I like this translation here where it says, Is it not necessary for you to also show mercy to your fellow servant as I have shown mercy to you? Mercy is a requirement of disciples in the kingdom. And so we cannot expect, to be lavished grace upon if we're not imaging God in the same way. And so I think that's the big difference here, is that it's not that, that God is some ruthless tyrant who turns on his people when they don't, earn their works-based righteousness, but rather the point of this, the analogy here is that it is expected in the kingdom to maintain the image of God, that we are to reflect his character, his nature, his love, his mercy. And that if those things aren't shown, that there is judgment to be paid. It makes us really question our own hearts and say, am I really a disciple of this kingdom if I cannot show the same mercy I have been shown to others? And so I think this parable is meant to force us to reflect on our own hearts and say, am I being shown, or am I showing the same mercy that I have been shown by God? In this parable here, the act of forgiveness and the act of judgment, I think, are expressions of God's grace. Because in this, if we look at the end of here where, he's sent off to be tortured and his family sold into slavery, these are, of course, meant to shock the listener. They're meant to shock the hearer. And I think in doing that, it's to say part of God's grace, part of God's mercy is to sometimes shock us into falling into the parameters that have been set by the kingdom, that we are to live outside of our natural inclination, which is to not show mercy, to not show grace, and to rather show this sort of reckless grace and mercy that comes with being part of God's kingdom. So I appreciate you listening. I know there was a lot of rambling in there. There's a lot going on in this passage. I look forward to being able to unpack it a little more, but I thank you for your time, and we'll continue to look forward to interacting with you in this class and other classes to come.